Hi everybody, and welcome to Mark Overanalyzes Film. 'Tis the season to watch movies, gorge on ice cream and Pepsi, and apologize for wishing that your family would disappear. So today I will be overanalyzing the Christmas classic, Home Alone. Before I begin, allow me to remind you that I am available for reading, script editing, and story coaching at markoveranalyzesstory.com. And also, if you enjoyed this podcast, please do share and or recommend it. It really would be a great help. Home Alone was directed by Chris Columbus and was written by John Hughes, and John Hughes is one of those writers who just understood something about the form. His films are often eccentric, idiosyncratic, kind of weird, and they always work. And on that note, there are two potentially related aspects that I am particularly interested in exploring as I overanalyze Home Alone. The first is something that I think Home Alone is a perfect example of, and that is that almost all stories are based on two competing ideas or thematic arguments going up against each other. And one of the purest forms of storytelling is to show us that our hero firmly believes one side of the argument at the start of the film, before eventually realizing that the other side of the argument is actually correct. And the moral that Kevin learns and how he learns it in Home Alone is a perfect example of this, I think. The second is more peculiar and particular to Home Alone. This is, really a story about a child who learns to appreciate his family. But when you think about Home Alone, you probably think about a precocious child brutalizing some hapless home invaders. Which is odd because Harry and Marv don't actually break into Kevin's house until 76 minutes into the film. So why is this sequence so dominant in our memories? How do these two plots coexist in one movie? How do they form a cohesive whole? Or do they? Well, keeping all that in mind, first I'll look at the fundamental features of the protagonist, and then I'll go through the main story beats by looking at the sequences of the film. Finally, I'll talk about the main things I learned along the way. So, let's begin by defining our protagonist. Kevin McAllister is an 8-year-old, precocious, youngest member of a large family. He also lives in a gigantic house that every grown-up millennial I know of now looks at and thinks, how did I not notice how amazing that house was as a kid? But besides that, there are really 3 ways that we define just who the film's protagonist really is. That is their life dream, their want, and their need. So, life dream is basically what Kevin wants when we first meet him and before the events of the story really get going. So as I said, Home Alone is a story with a protagonist who believes one thing at the start and the total opposite at the end. So Kevin's life dream is kind of the dramatic representation of the counter-argument of the film then. So, Kevin's life dream is essentially for his family to get lost so that he can finally do whatever he wants. So the next thing is the protagonist's capital W want, which is really the tangible objective for the long second act of our film. Now, normally a film needs a want or a tangible objective to essentially give the protagonist a goal to strive for and therefore something to keep them busy while they're growing as a character, and it has to be both significant enough to last through the whole act and tangible enough so that we can definitively say that they have achieved it or not. This gives the story its sense of a beginning, a middle, and an end, or before, journey of change, and after. Now, to my mind, Kevin is the protagonist, but really the tangible objective that gives the second act its shape belongs to his mother, Kate. At minute 26, she has one of the most iconic sudden realizations in modern cinema history, and she has one mission from that moment on. While Kevin does have to learn to look after himself, his objectives kind of shift more as he grows throughout the story. Kate's single objective is the one that gives Home Alone its definition, as we will see. So, finally, what is the need? And this one has to belong to the protagonist, because the need is the human quality or piece of wisdom or central lesson or moral that the protagonist lacks at the beginning of our story, but learns by its end. And this is what makes Home Alone a true Christmas movie, I think, because Kevin's need is a textbook Christmas lesson. I'll talk about this more later, but fundamentally, Kevin needs to stop being so selfish and unappreciative and realize how much his family actually means to him. Okay, so now that I've defined our protagonist for our story, let's have a look at the acts and sequences of Home Alone. There are traditionally, but not always, 3 acts and 8 sequences or stages in a film. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension underneath them, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length. A good way to think about it is that every 10 to 15 minutes, the audience should be on some level asking themselves a different dramatic question. So, Act 1 has our first 2 sequences, and the first one is always pretty much life as it is. And life as it is pretty chaotic in the McAllister household. Now, this is a brilliant, fun, and funny opening sequence, so there's a few things to point out here. One, it sets up the scenario immediately. Within seconds, we know that this is a big family going on a trip, and the house is vibrating with energy. We are also introduced to our antagonist Harry from almost the first frame, and we are basically told how to feel about him. Harry is scary enough because he's sly and he's a lot bigger than Kevin, but also he's not that scary because he fails to impose himself and is completely given the runaround by the older kids. The second thing to point out here is, in a good story, the protagonist will almost always be introduced by having a problem to solve. And the way they try to solve that problem will help define them for us. So, we soon meet Kevin, and he has a problem. Uncle Frank won't let him watch a film on TV. And how does he try to solve this problem? By bothering his mom until she agrees to help. But she doesn't. She hands him off to Kevin's dad, Peter, and Peter hands him off to Kevin's aunt, who then tells Kevin to pack his suitcase. This then sends Kevin into a panic and he runs around asking for help again, this time from his siblings. And this triggers just wall-to-wall iconic responses. My own personal favourite is his sister's line, "You're what the French call les incompetents." Now, it's important to note here that Kevin's first scene is really good, because it not only defines him by his problem. In addressing his problem, he reveals important characteristics. He's needy and a bit of a brat, but we also learn that he's surprisingly into crafts. Beyond wanting to watch grown-up movies, the first thing we learn about Kevin is that he's been using a glue gun to make ornaments out of fishhooks. So, in his very brief first scene, we can see what Kevin wants, to be able to do what he likes without limitations imposed by his family. We can see his flaw that he will need to overcome, that he is, as an 8-year-old, understandably needy, self-involved, and a bit of a brat. And we can see a clear talent. He is handy or crafty, in perhaps both senses of the word. That is a perfect defining opening scene for our protagonist. Anyways, with Kevin taking a bunch of abuse and worrying about sharing a bed with Pepsi-guzzling bedwetter Fuller, and then not getting any cheese pizza, the youngest child finally snaps, pushes Buzz, and accidentally creates a scene. As punishment for the fact that he's acting up, Kate sends him up to the 3rd floor. And this is a really important moment. The whole backbone of this film is the relationship between Kevin and his mom, but there are actually only 3 scenes in the entire film where they are alone together. We see them in Kevin's first scene, where we see their usual dynamic. We see them in the climactic scene, where they are emotionally reunited. And in between, we only have this one scene, right at the end of the first sequence, where the protagonist who doesn't want his family tells the dramatic representative of that family just that.
Then maybe you should ask Santa for a new family.
I don't want a new family. I don't want any family. Families suck.
Just stay up there. I don't want to see you again for the rest of the night.
I don't want to see you again for the rest of my whole life. And I don't want to see anybody else either.
I hope you don't mean that. You'd feel pretty sad if you woke up tomorrow morning and you didn't have a family.
No, I wouldn't.
Then say it again. Maybe it'll happen.
I hope I never see any of you jerks again.
So, That means it's about time for Home Alone's inciting incident, or the event without which our story, as it is, would not happen. With the whole family finally asleep, a storm knocks out their electricity. The film is called Home Alone, so we wonder if the McAllisters will make their flight, and if and when they will remember that Kevin is alone upstairs. That means that at minute 13, we have our first real tension, so we enter Home Alone's Sequence 2. Now, really, this sequence belongs to Kevin's mom, Kate, as we wonder when the penny will drop. So, with their alarm clocks going off, the McAllisters are woken by an airport taxi at their door, and panicky mayhem ensues. Unfortunately, as eldest cousin Heather does a headcount, she accidentally includes busybody neighbour Mitch Murphy, and our path is set. The family do make their flight, because, man, airports look more fun before 9/11, and Kevin wakes to discover that his family has disappeared. Now, this is a bit in the weeds, but bear with me for just a second. At the start of the second act, we always have what we can term the rejection of the call. The protagonist has been called to change after they've started their adventure, but instead they initially retrench into their previous way of being. Now, I don't think the second act has technically started yet, but Kevin exhibits the rejection of the call a bit early because the want, the thing that gives shape to the second act, belongs to Kate, so it's not so reliant on Kevin. Anyways, all that matters is that we have the general story shape and that it works. So Kevin's need is to grow up and appreciate his family, right? So what does he do when he believes that he's made his family disappear? He celebrates wildly and embraces every indulgent childish impulse he's ever had. He jumps on his parents' bed, messes around with Buzz's BB gun, and watches the iconic Angels with Filthy Souls while scoffing a gigantic mound of ice cream and washing it down with Pepsi. But of course, the film scares him and he makes his first small step towards his need by calling out for his mom. And, as if she can hear him somewhere deep in her subconscious, Kate is suddenly disturbed by the thought that she's forgotten something. She probes and probes until we have her famous moment of realization.
Did you lock up?
Yeah.
Did you close the garage?
That's it. I forgot to close the garage, that's it.
No, that's not it.
What else could we be forgetting?
Kevin!
Kevin is home alone, and Kate is going to have to try to get back to him before anything bad happens. That is our big tension. So at minute 26, we end Act 1, and we enter Act 2. Act 2 begins with Sequence 3, the first attempts to solve the problem. Now, the overall tension for this sequence belongs to Kate, and we're wondering if she's going to be able to find a flight straight back to Chicago. But one thing that Home Alone does really well is that it charts the story across its three main storylines. Now, what I mean by that is that in every sequence, there will be a movement in the story of Kate, a movement in the story of Kevin and his growing need, and a movement in the story of the Wet Bandits. So we're going to see this here especially because Act 2 always begins with what we can call the what's the plan scene. In other words, the film is going to tell us what our second act is going to look like at the start of that act. So Kevin immediately goes sledding down the stairs because he's still enjoying his childish freedom. Then we see that Kate is fretting on the airplane while they try and fail to call the house. Then, as Kevin falls asleep watching How the Grinch Stole Christmas, the Wet Bandits make their first move on the house. The bungling burglars wake Kevin, who sees their silhouettes, and he scares them off by turning off the lights. But, not knowing that that has worked, Kevin hides under his parents' bed. And here is where Kevin will stop rejecting the call and finally accept it. In other words, he will make his first unconscious move towards his need to grow up and appreciate his family.
This is ridiculous. Only a wimp would be hiding under a bed. And I can't be a wimp. I'm the man of the house. Hey! I'm not afraid anymore! I said I'm not afraid anymore! Do you hear me?
Now that Kevin has made this move, it's time for this stage of the story to end. So the McAllisters land in Paris, call the incompetent cops who do nothing, and then attempt to get a flight back to Chicago. Unfortunately, there's nothing available for another 2 days. Kate won't give up though, so she decides to stay in the airport and hope to catch a break on standby. So, Kate could not get a flight straight back, and our sequence tension has been answered. In its place, we have a new tension. Will Kate be able to get a flight on standby? And so, at minute 35, we enter sequence 4, the Grader attempts to solve the problem. And you might notice that as soon as we move into this new sequence, Kevin's behavior starts to significantly change. Only a few minutes ago, he was watching forbidden movies while gorging on junk food. Now, at minute 35, he is cleaning up after taking a shower. He tells himself that he washed every crevice, even between his toes and in his belly button. And then, of course, he famously copies his father and applies some stinging aftershave. You can see the development, right? It's also at this moment that Kevin tells us his mini objective for this sequence. He can't find his toothbrush, presumably because his mother packed it for him, so he now has to go and buy a new one. This is where he notices something is off at the neighbor's house, and we discover the wet bandits are in action. Looting the neighbors, Harry and Marv discover that the McAllisters really are in Paris, and the house should be easy pickings. From here, Kevin attempts to buy a toothbrush, but gets scared by Old Man Marley and runs off. So by now, we're approaching the film's midpoint, and two things generally happen at the midpoint. Most importantly, the protagonist makes their first conscious move towards their need, and we'll get to that in a moment, but also, almost always, the midpoint will foreshadow the climax of our film. So, 15 minutes ago, all Kevin had to do was turn on the lights to scare off Harry and Marv. But at minute 45, when they pull up outside the house, it looks like there is a massive party in full swing. We discover that Kevin has rigged the entire place to scare them away. So, this not only shows the progression of both parties, but this is going to seem awfully familiar in about 40 minutes' time. Now, we're really close to the midpoint at this stage, so the really big movements begin to take place. In Kate's story, it is here that she convinces an older couple to do the right thing and let her have their ticket. She catches a flight back to the States, and she has made a huge step towards where she needs to be. And again, you can see how this foreshadows our climax. But more importantly, you might remember that this whole thing happened because Kevin threw a strop because he couldn't get a slice of cheese pizza. Now he orders a whole pizza to himself. But no sooner does he have this pizza all to himself than he finds himself alone in his parents' bed, missing his family. And it's here, 50 minutes into a 99-minute runtime, almost exactly halfway, Kevin makes his first conscious move towards his need of growing up and appreciating his family.
I didn't mean it. If you come back, I'll never be a pain in the butt again. I promise. Good night.
Kate has answered our sequence tension by getting a flight from standby, and Kevin has made his big step towards his need. So that means it's time for Home Alone's sequence 5, the honeymoon sequence. The honeymoon sequence is so called because, having made this move towards their need, things generally go pretty well for the protagonist for a while. And so it is here, more or less. Kevin has now made 2 big steps towards growing up, so what do we find him doing? Buying the groceries and finding a way to cook for himself by buying a microwave meal. He even uses a coupon, which I still haven't figured out how to do. Furthermore, when he gets home, he does some laundry in the basement and is now able to face up to the scary furnace down there. But of course, things can't go too well for too long or there wouldn't be much excitement. So Harry and Marv reinvestigate the McAllister house and become suspicious. Kevin, who is washing the dishes you might notice, uses angels with filthy souls to scare off Marv. But this time the wet bandits decide to stake out the place. And it's not just here where things are taking a turn. Now in Scranton, Kate has seemingly hit a dead end in her quest home. But, just as things look hopeless, Gus Polinski, the Polka King of the Midwest, appears to offer some assistance. Kate has a ride to Chicago, and she's going to make it after all. The question is now, will she make it on time to save Kevin from a home invasion? And so, at minute 59, we enter sequence 6, the bridge from the honeymoon to the low point. So, things are really starting to go downhill now. The wet bandits discovered that Kevin has been tricking them and they plan to come back at 9 p.m. and ransack the house. And you'll notice that when Kevin overhears them, his first response is, "Mom, where are you?" And at that, we see that Kate is stuck in a small van with 7 overenthusiastic polka musicians. Now, we know really that Kate is not going to make it back in time, so if you want to say the real tension here is, will Kevin be ready for the wet bandits at 9 o'clock, I'd be happy to agree, but you might notice that that's not really what Kevin is focused on for most of this sequence. And perhaps this sequence more than any typifies the sleight of hand of Home Alone. Kate is focused on getting home, Harry and Marv are focused on robbing the house, but Kevin spends the next 10 minutes engaging with his need. He visits a local Santa and tells him that he doesn't want any presents this year, only his family back. Which is sweet, because as adults, we know that Santa's purview is strictly limited to toys and presents. Kevin then walks home and on the way sees a big family getting together for the Yuletide season. And it clearly stirs memories and regrets for this poor little 8-year-old who thinks his family has disappeared right on the eve of Christmas. So, as he soon wanders past a church, the lonely little boy decides to go inside. He is joined by Old Man Marley, and this is just a brilliant scene that pulls a lot of threads together from start to finish. Marley tells Kevin that he's here to see his granddaughter sing. Then, Kevin admits that he's been kind of a pain recently and he's upset about it because he actually really likes his family. So, we can see here that Kevin's transformation is complete. In Act 1, he wished his family would disappear. In Sequence 3, he partied at the thought of being alone. In Sequence 4, he asks for his family to come back. In Sequence 5, he started to act grown up. And here in Sequence 6, this 8-year-old boy has asked Santa to forget bringing him presents so that he can just have his family back before admitting that he has behaved poorly and that he really likes them. But this is not the climax of the film. This is right around the low point. So, what happens when Kevin tells Marley about his family?
You want to know the real reason why I'm here right now?
Sure.
I came to hear my granddaughter sing. And I can't come and hear her tonight.
You have plans?
No. I'm not welcome.
At church?
Oh, you're always welcome at church. I'm not welcome with my son. Years back, before you and your family moved on the block, I had an argument with my son.
How old is he?
Well, he's grown up. We lost our tempers, and I said I didn't care to see him anymore. He said the same. We haven't spoken to each other since.
So, Kevin recommends that he call his son, but Marley asks with apprehension, "What if he won't talk to me?" So on the one hand, Kevin has changed. On the other hand, the film tells us that sometimes these fights can be terminal, or at least leave a devastating mark on family dynamics for years. And with no sign of his family, Kevin may well no longer believe the counter-argument, but the real danger, we are told through Marley, is that he may well never get the chance to embrace the real argument. That is a textbook low point. But there's one more thing for this scene to do, and it's kind of bizarre that it's able to do it. It transitions us pretty suddenly from Kevin's engagement with his need to what Home Alone is really known for. As Kevin wanders down the church aisle, the bells toll, and he suddenly realizes that he has to get home in order to protect it from Harry and Marv. It's such a sudden transition, and it shouldn't work, but somehow it never ever bothers me. Kevin rushes home, vows to defend his house, and begins booby-trapping. But again, you might notice that after all the tar and the nails and the micro machines, the last thing Kevin does is cook a meal for himself and sit to have it at the dining room table with some candles. He really has grown up, but he won't have time to eat because the wet bandits have turned up. Kate has not made it back in time. Things look bad, so at minute 76, with 22 minutes left, we end Act 2, and we enter Act 3. Act 3 has a false resolution and a true resolution, and I don't know if any film has a more famous false resolution than Home Alone. Just the concept of it is almost more famous than the film itself. Now, what can you say about 15 minutes of just first-class physical comedy and capering? Well, I'll come back to talk about if and how this sequence fits into the entirety of Home Alone, but for now, let me just point out a couple of things. We're mostly with Harry and Marv here, and if we take the definition that dramatic tension is that someone wants something badly and is having difficulty getting it, well, the dramatic tension here is certainly with the wet bandits. But also, this is not just 15 minutes of one funny thing after another. This 15-minute sequence has its own mini story structure. So, we're wondering if Harry and Marv will catch Kevin. That is our overall tension, let's say. So, Harry and Marv first try to talk Kevin into letting them in the back door before Kevin shoots them with Buzz's BB gun. Then, this kind of kicks off the second act of the sequence, when the two burglars decide to split up to break in. There's a kind of refusal of the call when Marv discovers that the basement door is actually unlocked and he appears to be in. But then the burglars have an acceptance of the call, or a first unconscious move towards their need, or their eventual climax, when Marv gets hit with an iron and his shoes and socks are removed by the tarred steps, while Harry burns his hand on the front door. So, they both make greater attempts to solve the problem. Harry tries the back door and Marv finds an open window, and they get feathered and glass in their feet for their troubles. But 7.5 minutes into our 15-minute sequence, so our midpoint at exactly halfway, the wet bandits reunite inside the house. The honeymoon stage then follows when Kevin asks if they've had enough or if they're thirsty for more before he calls the cops. So again, you can see how this is foreshadowing the climax of this sequence. But then, the honeymoon stage ends and things begin to look murkier. Marv manages to grab Kevin's ankle and the whole thing is almost over at that, except for the intervention of a tarantula. And then you might notice that the sort of second act of this sequence ends because with 3 minutes in it left, Kevin and the wet bandits leave the house. Now, breaking into the house to catch Kevin was the objective after Kevin shot them with BBs, but now the objective has changed, which gives this a mini Act 3 kind of vibe. And just like any Act 3, it has a false resolution and a true resolution. Harry realizes that Kevin wants them to follow him, so the burglars outmaneuver the child, and it looks like the game might be up. But then, with 1 minute left in our 15-minute sequence, our true resolution reveals itself, and Old Man Marley arrives to save Kevin and return him safely home before the cops arrive to arrest the wet bandits. So perhaps one of the reasons why this 15 minutes of zany physical comedy looms so large is, yes, because it has a great setup and it's really, really funny, but also because it is, in and of itself, a perfectly structured mini story. It has an Act 1, an Act 2 with a midpoint and a low point, and then a perfect Act 3 with a false resolution and a true resolution. But ultimately, of course, it is only one sequence in a larger story. And so, with 8 minutes left, it's time for Home Alone's true resolution. And for my money, this ending is not perfect. Kevin somehow cleans the house to a spit shine, which is absurd, but let's not bring logic into it now, and he puts stockings up for his family and presents under the tree. But when he wakes up Christmas morning, he runs down to find nothing. He once again finds himself home alone. But then, as he sits on his parents' bed contemplating his lost family and their family photo, he hears the door open downstairs and his mother calling for him. Kate looks around and her heart melts as she sees the effort Kevin has gone to prepare the family for Christmas morning. And then we have our climactic moment as mother and son are finally reunited. But note, Kate wishes Kevin a Merry Christmas, and Kevin initially doesn't react. There's just a hint that Kevin, in his maelstrom of feelings here, might not forgive his mother for their fight and or for abandoning him. But then, in our defining moment, Kate apologizes to Kevin and he rushes to hug her for dear life.
Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Oh, Kevin, I'm so sorry.
At that, the rest of the family arrive in the door and discover that Kevin has somehow not only looked after himself, but bought essentials for the house. And there's just time for one more moment. In minute 6 of Act 1, Kevin shut the curtains on a scary-looking old man Marley shoveling snow on his own in the dark. Now, at the very end of our story, he waves to an old man Marley who has learned the same lesson Kevin has, and is also hugging his once estranged family members for dear life. And it's good that Kevin gets to see this, because Buzz is about to murder him for destroying his room. Families. Home Alone is one of those movies that I enjoyed before, but that I love after overanalyzing it. I think it's a perfect family Christmas film, and it's now no surprise to me whatsoever that it is one of the all-timer Christmas classics. But there are two things in particular that I would really like to talk about, as I mentioned above. So, the first is that Home Alone does something that I think so many modern films do not do enough. Basically, it gives Kevin real reasons to believe the counter-argument. What I love about Home Alone is that while it relies on an incredible confluence of circumstance for its plot, its story is really grounded in character and human flaws. Kate doesn't get mad at Kevin because of a misunderstanding. Kevin is being annoying and acting up. But also, Kevin is being annoying and acting up because he's getting pushed around by his siblings. When Kevin tells Marley that he likes his family even though sometimes he thinks he doesn't, Marley doesn't shrug it off or dismiss it. Marley responds, "How you feel about your family is a complicated thing." And some of the most memorable sequences in Home Alone are based on this idea. The opening sequence is so funny and so memorable because of how hilariously withering and dismissive Kevin's siblings are. And what I love about this film is that it knows it doesn't have to tell you, oh look, they're acting like this, but they're actually good people, or something, or they actually love each other. The parents are maxed out and the siblings are teenagers. We understand that. We don't have to see them turn around and really be nice to each other. We get it. And the one-liners are amazing. The rejection of the call in sequence 3 also reflects this. Kevin, finally free of his family, watches movies, eats ice cream, drinks Pepsi, and does whatever he wants. And it's fun. As is sequence 7, the false resolution, when it appears as though Kevin's family won't make it back and Kevin fends off Harry and Marv by booby-trapping the house himself. But the fact that the ideas in these sequences seem to have real merit only strengthens the moments when the real argument comes to the fore. When Kevin finally gets a whole cheese pizza all to himself, for example, the very next scene shows him asking his family to please come back. We understand why Kevin would be so annoyed with Buzz for eating his cheese pizza, why he would be so delighted to finally get a whole one to himself, and why, immediately after doing this, he would immediately miss his family. Home Alone might be a kid's movie, but there's nothing childish about that sort of storytelling. It is so much more nuanced and true and trusts its audience than any number of supposedly complex adult-themed films I've seen in recent years. Okay, Mark, but people don't remember Home Alone for the fact that Kevin feels repentant after presumably eating too much cheese pizza. Home Alone is iconic for a 15-minute sequence where an 8-year-old boy inflicts all kinds of pain on 2 grown men who attempt to break into his house. And this is just such a fun, basely satisfying concept that you might wonder if the rest of the film is just there to support it, or if this could just be inserted into a film about something else, and it's fine because it's just so fun. So, how does this sequence actually fit into the broader story of an 8-year-old boy who learns to appreciate his family? Well, presumably at this point, it won't surprise anyone to know that I think the main thing to consider is the thematic ideas in Home Alone, and to define exactly what the arguments going up against each other are. And I think what's interesting here is that for me, both the argument and the counter-argument as I see them are kind of double helixes, with 2 ideas wrapped around each other. Now, someone smarter than me can probably see the core element that connects them, but as best as I can tell, the counter-argument, let's say, is related to the fact that 1, Kevin wants to be alone and free to do whatever he wants, and 2, Kevin is a child who is, understandably, reliant on others. So, in sequence 1, Kevin is complaining because Uncle Frank won't let him watch a movie. He has to pack a suitcase, and he has to share a bed with Fuller. But his way of dealing with it is to try to annoy others until his problems are basically solved for him. So, then the argument is the opposite of these 2 ideas combined. 1, Kevin learns to appreciate his family just as they are, as 2, he also learns to be independent. It's after he decides he has to be brave at the first unconscious move towards his need that he showers himself, copies his dad's behavior, and decides to go out and get a toothbrush. It's after he learns to order a pizza that he asks his family to come back and promises never to be a pain in the butt again. And it's after he makes that promise that he goes grocery shopping for milk and fabric softener. And it's in this combination, I think, that we can see the relationship between our false resolution and our true resolution, and therefore between, the break-in and the story as a whole. At the low point of a story, the protagonist no longer believes the counter-argument, but the argument seems impossible. So Kevin has learned to be independent and appreciate his family, but, he's an 8-year-old boy, his family is nowhere to be found, and his family home is under attack by 2 scary adults. Even when he calls 911, you'll notice he puts on an adult voice, because he probably figures they won't listen to a child. Now, in sequence 1, we learned that Kevin has been using a glue gun to make ornaments out of his dad's new fish hooks, and yet he can't pack a suitcase. The reason that Kevin survives the false resolution then, with all its menace, is because he has managed to combine his natural characteristics and talents with his developed need. He combines his craftiness, in both senses of the term, with a determination to be independent and protect his family home. And because the film all the way through has married the idea that independence and appreciating his family for who they are interrelated, and because the Wet Bandits themselves behave like such spite-driven children, it somehow feels apt that a false resolution where a little boy foils 2 burglars would give way to a true resolution where said little boy embraces his mother selflessly and wholeheartedly. Something in that consistent thematic relationship, I think, is somehow how Home Alone is both a film with an incredible 15-minute physical comedy home invasion sequence and an all-time feel-good Christmas classic about the importance of appreciating each other despite our faults. This has been Mark Overanalyzes Film on Home Alone, wishing all of you out there a Merry Christmas, you filthy animal, and a Happy New Year. Take care of yourselves, and see you soon.